to this presentation. We are running a series. We have a series of what we call AFS Presents, which is intended really to offer some topics of current interest. We want to stimulate as much interest as possible in the department and in the kind of work that we professors do. And we are very privileged on this occasion to have Dr. Zebulon Miletsky present on something that I think you should find extremely interesting, the hip-hop generation remix. So help me welcome Dr. Miletsky, and I'm going to turn everything
Thank you, Dr. Hurley. Welcome everybody. So glad to see that we have, I guess it looks like to be a pretty full house. Almost all the chairs are taken. And I do so appreciate you making the time to be here and supporting our department and being here for this talk. Before I get started, there's a few people I have to thank, and I hope you'll indulge me just for a moment. I think it's important to give thanks and respect where it's due. The first thanks that I need to give is to my colleagues, my esteemed colleagues of this department. Most of you probably are friends of the department or have taken classes in the department, and so you know all too well the level of talent and training and expertise that resides here in Africana Studies. But I want to start by thanking our chair, Dr. Anthony Hurley, who you just heard from and probably know very well. Can we give him also a round of applause? Because his vision and leadership is what makes these things possible. I want to thank every member of the department, Dr. Abena Assar, George Furon, Dr. Shamilis Balema, Dr. Don Harris, who's been a friend, mentor, and a colleague who has, as a younger colleague, who's helped me to get things together. The esteemed Dr. Les Owens, who was one of the people who set up this library that we're sitting in right now and helped to build this collection, among other things. The list is too long, so we won't go through it. But just to give an example, I always like to mention the fact that if there's any mistake about how mentorship works, Dr. Owens was a professor in this department when one of my professors was a graduate student taking courses here. And so that cycle just continues and that positivity regenerates. And so here we are. And last but not least, Dr. Tracy Walters, who probably cannot be here today, but certainly has been a friend and a colleague, and also. So I just would like to also give a round of applause for all the faculty in the department. I have a whole long list of other people, but we probably can't go through all of them now. But I'll just say real quickly, I'd like to thank the dean, Nancy Squires, graduate students who. Well, at least one who I've been working with, Tiffany Thompson, who's working on a master's thesis on hip hop. I'm kind of a late add to the team, but she's been working with folk in the department. Sean Purvis, Andre Morgan, who will be future graduate students, hopefully, in this department, and my course, the members of my class, as well as other folks on campus who have been tremendously supportive. So he must have just heard his name because here's Andre now. That includes Christina Vargas Law, Dr. Jarvis Watson, EDD, and Cheryl Chambers, Associate Dean, Cultural Affairs. Today, the title of my talk is The Hip Hop Generation Remixed. Where are the hip hop activists? And I assume that a lot of folk in the room probably know a lot about hip-hop. You probably know about artists. You probably know about certain songs. You probably even know down to the lyrics. But what I want to talk about a little bit today is another side of hip-hop that you might not be as aware of, which is hip-hop activism. And there has been some movements afoot for quite some time now, in fact, that have been trying to take hip-hop to a more political place, to a more conscious place, to a more progressive place. And so that's what I intend to talk a little bit about today. And so I prepared some comments that I'm pretty much going to read, but feel free to, if you have questions that will come up at the end, that we can certainly discuss and sort of, take some asides here and there as necessary. Okay. In a recent article that appeared in the Chronicle of Higher Education entitled, "Colleges Love Hip-Hop, but Do They Love Black Men Too?" It is reported that hip-hop represents the latest attempt by contemporary universities to rebrand themselves. As competition for students, financial support, and star professors intensifies in the increasingly competitive world of courting tuition dollars, your tuition dollars, hip-hop has become a way to draw young people to school. The article poses the question, do they love black men? Because in all the rush to embrace hip-hop, something has been excluded here. In February of this year, when the article was published, the College of William and Mary followed in the footsteps of Cornell, Harvard, and colleges that are part of the Atlanta University Center by establishing a hip-hop library collection. With more than 300 college courses related to hip-hop offered each year, full-fledged hip-hop degrees now represent a niche market, repositioning themselves in the education marketplace. The article goes on to state, institutions of higher learning are failing to address the most problematic irony of hip-hop studies. The explosion of hip-hop in the academy has not coincided with positive educational gains for black men. While colleges race to analyze the street-born music, body movements, art, and poetry, the people whose imagery are most associated with hip-hop, young black men, continue to be left behind. Several current members of the hip-hop generation, as well as some from the pioneer generation, the old school, are now serving as visiting professors and lecturers at several top-name colleges and universities around the country. These include Zulu Nation founder Africa Bambaataa, serving as a visiting professor at Cornell University. M1 of Dead Prez. How many people know who M1 is? Okay. Never mind.
We're not that old, not that old.
M1 of Dead Prez. Okay, that was 2000s, bro. Serving as a lecturer at Haverford College. Now, these are good schools. Little B, or Lil B, I guess. A relatively young newcomer to the game, serving as a visiting professor at New York University, NYU. These visiting professors are often paid sometimes in excess of $20,000 to $25,000 per lecture and or appearance. The article goes on to state that, quote, black men when they are hip-hop entertainers are in high demand on college campuses. Bun B of UGK is a professor at Rice University. Wyclef Jean is a professor at Brown University. That one maybe I can see. Jizza of the Wu-Tang. Hello.
Wu-Tang.
Get ready. Harvard University. Oh, I know. Okay, maybe. Ninth Wonder. Okay, and the list goes on and on at Duke University. Have recently become lecturers or visiting professors. Sadly, rappers are being recruited to teach at colleges where black male students are largely absent. Needless to say, their duties are often somewhat light, including having TAs, grade papers, as well as not having to serve on campus full-time or be in residence in any meaningful way. Oh, if we had that here at Stony Brook. The point is that while these universities are very eager to pay the somewhat hefty salaries and fees to these artists, the black male students at their universities are languishing academically. And we all know the statistics. The article quotes a report published last year by the University of Pennsylvania, which documents the crisis facing black men in higher education and warns that things are getting worse. According to the report, the relative number of black men entering college hasn't improved since 1976, and only 33% of black male college students graduate within 6 years. Not 4 years, 6 years. The current graduation rate for black males in colleges and universities hovers somewhere around 33.1%, compared with 44.8% for black women, according to the U.S. Department of Education. The total graduation rate is 57.3% for black men in general. Add to that the fact that black men are frequently harassed and stopped on their university campuses and oftentimes treated as outsiders, if not criminals. I'll bet almost every black man on this campus has a story, whether you're from a professor down to a graduate student, down to an undergraduate student. Maybe not at this campus, but at most campuses. And that includes Harvard and all the other campuses we mentioned. Decreasing acceptance of hip-hop at some of the nation's top colleges and universities continues to contrast with the somewhat negligent treatment of black men. In December, the same researchers responsible for the Penn study, quote, demonstrated that black male student athletes were winning championship trophies for their colleges, but were leaving without obtaining degrees. Only about half of black male student athletes graduate from big division sports colleges within 6 years. Half. And we know the stories. You've seen it. You know, you have those glory years, but then afterwards, what do you do if you didn't graduate or if you didn't finish? A cynical interpretation is that black men are brought to campuses mainly to entertain, with dazzling athleticism, less so for their contributions to intellectual life. The politics of conservation and public memory are also in contention here, as these exclusive and somewhat prestigious hip-hop archives at Cornell University, at Harvard University, check out the hip-hop archives at Harvard, this is Harvard, are often in possession of countless artifacts and paraphernalia of hip-hop worth thousands of dollars, maybe millions. In at least one case at Cornell University, the archives are largely off-limits to the students, many of whom hail from the South Bronx themselves, okay, where it all began. So who are the archivists? Who are the collectors? Have they earned their bona fides in hip-hop? Have they shown and proven, right? That's what they say, you have to show and prove. Have they shown and proven as hip-hop dictates for MCs and artists? What is the solution, if any? Hip-hop should be used to change how colleges recruit black men and help them graduate on time. Black males at Cornell have stepped up to tell the administration that they're underappreciated and underserved. Consequently, Cornell has committed, because of their activities, their activism, and I'm not saying that anyone should do that here necessarily, but, you know, maybe. Because of their activities, Cornell has committed $5 million to bring posses, quote-unquote posses, of underrepresented students to the campus each year, ensuring that those students won't feel so isolated. And the organization, I love this, Students Working Ambitiously to Graduate, or SWAG. Holler if you hear me, come on. Providing black men with mentors and a sense of community. The goal is to raise black male graduation rates. So give them credit, they did try to get their act together. So things are changing, and I would submit that that's an example of hip-hop activism. This article got me thinking about my own journey in hip-hop. Hip-hop is one of those things that everyone has their own story to tell. Testimony is critical, and dues paying is a must. What seems to upset most people about this seeming disparity between universities and black men on the one hand, and efforts to encourage and protect and preserve the memories of hip-hop on the other, and its mistreatment of black men in the process, is that only a decade ago, those same universities showed not only zero interest in all things hip-hop, but did their level best to destroy efforts to celebrate hip-hop on college campuses. So I'm talking about, like, if you're planning a concert, or you're trying to bring an act to campus, or you're trying to set up a party, you know, you'd have to go into the oral tradition to hear, you know, the things that get said behind closed doors as to why certain things cannot happen, okay? My personal experience with hip-hop would be classified as what author and cultural critic Nelson George calls the post-soul generation. I grew up in Boston, celebrating hip-hop in the early 1980s with groups out of New York City, of course, like Run DMC, the Fat Boys, Dana Dane, Slick Rick, and other popular artists of that day. Yes, I'm that old. I love you. I was heavily into breakdancing. I'm going to tell it to you all. although still a bit young to really get involved the way I wanted to, I had questions. Where were the breakdancing battles being held? How could I get there without a car? Or bringing my parents? How would I get home? In Boston, it was the Floor Lords who held sway and were known as the illest b-boy crew. And they really did, I don't know if they were as good as the New York groups, but they were friends with them. I wanted so badly to be part of it, but I was a little too young to get involved. I had the moves, but no way to get involved. Sadly, I would say I was like many American kids at that time, swept up in the breakdancing craze for a while, caught up in it as a trend, never having learned about its roots in 1970s New York, when it was originally called b-boying, by its most ardent practitioners, most of whom, though not all, but many, were Puerto Rican and Dominican. Another issue that Latinos, in my opinion, have been written out to some extent of the narrative of hip-hop. Not completely. And when they are included, they're included in ways that go against some racial formulations that is a whole other story. Like, if you talk to hip-hop heads, they'll say, oh yeah, we included the Puerto Ricans and Dominicans because they're black too. I'm just going to stop there. You know what I'm talking about. Which is, yes, okay, but there's more to it than that, right? I knew very little then about graffiti or tagging, although I knew I liked it. No, sadly, I was limited to breakdancing shows for my parents and larger family at home gatherings like Thanksgiving, which was kind of pathetic. But I held on to it. In fact, I brought an artifact of my own hip-hop history, a cassette tape. Boom! Run DMC.
Well, okay, at least it's wrong.
Thank you. I'm keeping it here for good luck. Hip-hop, or rap as it was commonly known at that time, was presented and marketed to kids our age as an alternative to what we ignorantly considered to be white music, rock and roll. Notwithstanding the fact that rock and roll was essentially invented by African Americans, and that hip-hop had probably more in common with what was classified as punk rock at the time. I remember watching Wild Style. How many people have seen Wild Style? Hurts. I have it on DVD. It's not VHS, bro.
Upgrade.
All right. I remember watching Wild Style for the first time at the Orson Welles Theater in Cambridge, Massachusetts. No one's going to know where that is, but if you were from Boston, you wouldn't know where that was. Maybe if you were my age. And wondering why Debbie Harry of Blondie was in the movie. I must have been like 12, so I didn't understand the connection. I basically just made the mental note and kept it moving. But later I came to understand that this was one of those cross-cultural moments when interracial cooperation and a class connection, class, common political interest, orientation, if nothing else, joined these two seemingly disparate genres of music. The dichotomy is really imposed later, I've realized, between what we used to ignorantly classify as rock, being white music, and rap being black music. Of course, we were into rap, and that was like part of our expression to say, like, well, we're into this, and we're rejecting that. So much so, we were ashamed to admit we liked rock music. Not realizing that behind the scenes, people like Rick Rubin and other rock and roll impresarios are the ones controlling and opening the doors in many ways for hip-hop. It's yet another moment where that cooperation, it seems to me, could have been so empowering and impactful on the industry. Perhaps we weren't ready, but had we understood or known that black and white people were cooperating in this way, right, and that cooperation could have had major, major implications for how hip-hop business was done. But there we are against that thing called race, of course. Could have been so empowering and impactful on the industry that it becomes one that has to be destroyed. And these false classifications of music have to be imposed such that by the Run DMC, does anybody remember when Run DMC and Aerosmith did that? Okay, thank you. I get a couple things. All right. That was like late 80s. Give me a break. Yeah, Run DMC, Aerosmith, walk this way, talk this way. Yeah. So that was like the hotness. You could say like, you know, finally like, okay, we like that, you know. But we're not feeling the other Aerosmith stuff. Meanwhile, they're from Boston. I didn't even know that. You know, and actually, so much so had we rejected some of that music, at least in my generation, in my group, that we thought it was something new. And of course, it really wasn't. DJ Davy D. Cook, please remember this name, DJ Davy D. Cook. Look him up, his blog. I'll try to add some things here after. Who has been a legend in hip-hop scholarship and activism since the 1990s. You know, no, he's not at Harvard. No, he's not at those other places. But he's like underground and the smartest voice out there on hip-hop, in my opinion. Was born in the Bronx and sought his education in the Bay Area, enrolled at the University of California in the 1980s. His work as not only a commercial DJ in the industry, but more recently and more importantly as a hip-hop activist, serves as a model for the kind of true fighting spirit which was once more prevalent in hip-hop than it is today. Davey continues not only to fight, but to teach through his blog, as well as serve as an adjunct professor at the Afro-Am Studies program at San Francisco State College, the first black studies program in the nation, by the way, known simply to folks out there as Afros, what they call it. It is not an uncommon sight to see Davey building with cats in the game such as Chuck D, Africa Bambaataa, DJ Kool Herc, and many other artists who he counts as comrades and friends. I had a chance to sit in on one of his courses during spring break, in which he set up a Google Meetup, which allowed for an intergenerational dialogue between artists and some also artists and industry veterans and scholars and activists. Davey D has a more nuanced and perhaps less well-known version of historical events in hip-hop, one that resonates with hip-hop heads and activists who live through the culture and who have, through education consciousness, created a true love for hip-hop culture. He argued on his blog, to the point, about punk rock and hip-hop coming up at the same time. No offense to Run DMC, who are often cited as the first hip-hop group to merge rock and rap. When we really go back and look at what was happening in the late 70s and early 80s, we'll find that there was an often underreported important conversation and cultural exchange that was taking place with hardcore b-boys from the South Bronx and the disenfranchised, rebellious, new wave punk kids in downtown Manhattan on the Lower East Side and in the Village. I told you he was smart. The breakout moment in many ways for hip-hop really began when acts like Africa Bambaataa and Grandmaster Flash, who were just starting to record records, were starting to be invited to perform at some key downtown spots, like the Mud Club or the Roxy, which was frequented by punk new wave kids. So, you know, this is like a space, a sort of like interesting space where black and white is meeting for the first time. Hip-hop is coming out of the South Bronx. It really does not have a place yet. They're looking to get downtown. They want to get into Manhattan. This was the first entry point. And what an unlikely one at that. It's the big break hip-hop needs to escape the Bronx and enter the downtown scene, giving it the exposure it so desperately needed. Davey points out, quote, the parallels between the hardcore hip-hoppers from the Bronx and the rebellious punk kids soon became obvious. Both groups had reacted organically to a stale, formulaic music industry that was serving the public watered-down disco and arena rock. The blacks and Puerto Ricans in the Bronx embraced the classic James Brown soul and funk music of Sly and Family Stone and developed hip-hop, while the Lower East Side white counterparts got into the British import punk and new wave music. So, you know, I was talking to Davey D about this, and we were talking, like, somebody said, what's your favorite kind of music? And he starts talking about Roxy music and all of these, like, new wave bands from the 80s. And I was like, what? Like, I would never have thought that that was, you know, his thing. And then he went on to explain it. So very interesting. Another major distinction between so-called hip-hop activists and those who claim to be practicing hip-hop is the call for the responsibility of the artist. Davey D makes the argument that an artist, black artists throughout history, have had to make a contribution above and beyond that of their artistry. There is a little-known clip of a roundtable comprising of luminaries such as Harry Belafonte, Sidney Poitier, James Baldwin, Marlon Brando, and others discussing, this is basically about a month after the March on Washington, discussing the burgeoning civil rights movement, still very much a new presence and force in American life and culture at that time. And what we see in its infancy in many ways and fits and starts are these artists wrestling with the dilemma and question of what extent an artist has a responsibility to give back to society and connect their artistry with activism. What we see is a very interesting dialogue happening and a foreshadowing of what some artists would take to a very high level in terms of that engagement. One thinks of Nina Simone, the blues singer and soul singer, who was classically trained and could have had a very, successful career simply making her musical contribution. But she would eventually go on to make a controversial song called Mississippi Goddamn. And basically, you could probably guess what that's about. It was about what was happening in the South at that time, in the Civil Rights era. For many, it brought the horrors of what was happening there, with 3 civil rights workers lynched, Goodman, Schwerner, and Cheney, to the attention of the American public. Of course, this tradition goes back further. Billie Holiday, whose virtuosity exceeded most. She had talent for days, as hip-hop heads might say, and whose unique vocals gave her a special sound and voice that was both beautiful and acerbically abrasive. She put that voice into service on a song that identified the horrors of lynching in the South, called Strange Fruit, based on a poem written by Abel Meerpool, a white Jewish high school teacher from the Bronx. Most people know the song, but most people have never heard the poem that it's based on. And if you don't know how it goes, these are the lyrics, or the stanzas, I should say. Southern trees bear a strange fruit, blood on the leaves and blood at the root. Black bodies swinging in the southern breeze, strange fruit hanging from the poplar trees. This strange fruit that she's talking about, of course, are black bodies, and usually black men, black male bodies, who had been lynched in the South. And not only lynched, but whose memories were really ridiculed, because photographs would be taken of those bodies. And those photographs were used for things like postcards. How many people have seen the lynching postcard? We could just have a whole lecture just on that. Wrap our minds around that. What kind of society celebrates that kind of brutality in something as what's supposed to be light and happy? When do you send a postcard? On vacation, right? Okay. This leap forward was a risk for Holiday, artistically and commercially. Her music label at the time would not release this song, not only because of its controversial lyrics and subject matter, but because they did not think that it could become a commercially viable song. And this would be, something that we see come up over and over again, where artists want to do something to push the envelope. They want to speak out about the issues that are happening. They have the talent for days. They can do it. It's like, maybe I can, take the L on this one and just put this song out, right? Billie Holiday was that kind of person. But this leap, it was a risk. Today it stands out as one of Holiday's signature tunes, I would say, and the quintessential American protest song. It is probably one of the bravest acts of musical expression that one can think of, and stands out as one of the greatest songs of the 20th century. The haunting melody, Holiday's voice conjures up images of those southern trees and the strange fruit that was the black body swinging in the southern breeze. The next part of the song goes on, here is a fruit for the crows to pluck, for the rain to gather, for the wind to suck, for the sun to rot, for a tree to drop. Here is a strange and bitter crop. I can't keep talking about this because I'm going to get emotional, so we have to move on. But, the haunting beauty of that, of those lyrics and what they're saying, and the lives that were taken, okay, that it speaks for. Lives you can't get back. Heads of families, okay, gone. Many thousands gone. That song, paired with the NAACP's unsuccessful efforts to pass the Dwyer anti-lynching bill at the time, juxtaposed with the absurd need to photograph lynchings in the South on postcards, as we talked about, and greeting cards. Check out withoutsanctuary.org if you're interested and seeing some of those images. I would show them now, but it would take up too much time. But maybe at the end or something we can look at it. But he's got, he's a collector, and he, doesn't really like editorialize too much. He just has them. Okay, they're part of our past. Right? When people say stand up and say, well, we live in a country based on the roots of white supremacy, and people say, well, that's not true. Why? We can argue as you blue in the face and not convince somebody. I'd rather just take it to the thing. Here, look for yourself. It's my country, it's your country, it's our country, right? I love it just as much as you do. I love all of it, but this is part of it. Okay. Let's face it together, in other words. So occasionally you have those moments where that stuff rises to the top, in art or in other areas. And it's so much more powerful that way than trying to convince somebody something that they're just not going to hear. Withoutsanctuary.org, check that out. Those lyrics punctuated the need for something to be done, allowing the NAACP to somewhat helplessly fly the flag out in front of the national office, as they did after a lynching, every day after a lynching, that read, quote, "A black man was lynched today." People would walk beneath that flag and perhaps noticed it, and perhaps some stopped, and some simply walked on by without a care. Like most any other movement, hip-hop has its periodization, and therefore sets of years in which the music has been somewhat grouped together. Although the term hip-hop generation was first used in a kind of denigrating way in the early 90s, remember some of the cases, the First Amendment cases that came up, Luke Skywalker, that whole thing, these songs that people thought were using too many negative lyrics. They used the term hip-hop generation to denigrate, the current group at the time. It was more clearly defined and basically reclaimed, as often happened, in a more positive way by young people in the early 2000s, especially Bakari Kitwana, a longtime journalist and former editor of The Source, in his book, based on many of his articles, called The Hip-Hop Generation, Young Blacks and the Crisis in African American Culture. And some of my students know this book quite well because we read it in class, and I think it still holds up in a lot of ways. He defines the hip-hop generation as African Americans born between 1965 and 1984. This group is situated between the passage of the Civil Rights Act and the assassination of Malcolm X on one end, and hip-hop's explosion during the 1970s and 1980s. But the hip-hop generation can be more loosely defined to include minorities born between 1965 and 1984, who have grown up within a culture of hip-hop music, dance, fashion, and art. The title of my presentation was The Hip-Hop Generation Remixed, but could have just as easily been The Post-Hip-Hop Generation, which is the title of another book by Ross Baraka, that's Amiri Baraka's son, who looks at that time period as well. Or, I'm sorry, that's not his book, but he uses that term a lot. That's Molefe Asante's son, who has the book, The Post-Hip-Hop Generation. Because we are clearly moving into a new phase. In the first chapter of Kitwana's book, entitled The New Black Youth Culture, Emergence of the Hip-Hop Generation, he spells out what I think encapsulates pretty well what others have also called a post-civil rights generation. Now, no matter what we call it, we're talking about this set of years, and we're talking about this set of values that are sort of shared between these different constituents. More than anything else, I think his book, along with articles that appeared in The Source, Vibe, The Village Voice, and other magazines and periodicals, was a clarion call for generations that struggled to define, itself, the hip-hop generation, which overlaps with Generation X, but it was a different generation. It was the next generation after the turn of the century, the first generation, the turn of the 21st century, I should say, to grow up in post-segregation America, and the generation struggling to find its voice and contribution to the struggles and accomplishments of the past. This generation came of age with the election of George W. Bush in the year 2000. They were shaped by, eventually, 9/11, and looked more to Biggie and Tupac as heroes more than Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. They had been labeled as a crisis generation, Around their future was a question mark. What would this generation do in light of all that had been done beforehand? And one thinks of the lyrics of Notorious B.I.G., gunned down only a few years before that. And you might remember this. Back in the day, our parents used to take care of us. Look at them now. They even effing scared of us. I'm not gonna say. Calling the city for help because they can't maintain. Damn, stuff done changed. You know, and it was. Remember that time period. You know, this is gangbanging. This is kids losing their lives. There's all this violence in the streets. And people are saying, what is happening? B.I.G. probably did more to describe that time period than I think any other leader. Many descriptions of this group defy categorization, but one of Kitwana's descriptions rings true when he writes, quote, "Black pride is still an important part of this generation's identity. In fact, the population has embraced the idea of blackness in ways that parallel the black consciousness raising of the late 1960s and early 70s. The popularization of the Afrocentric movement from the late 1980s to 1990s, pro-black lyrics on the contemporary rap scene, which I will talk about in a minute, as well as traditional hairstyles, dreadlocks and braids, for example. Remember the natural style started to come back all of a sudden. Cornrows, etc. Adopted by many members of the hip-hop generation, all speak to this. If Kitwana does a very good job at defining what was then an amorphous group collectively known as the hip-hop generation, I prefer another formulation by Nelson George, what he describes as the post-soul nation. He writes, "At its most elemental level, hip-hop is a product of civil rights era America, a set of cultural forms originally nurtured by African Americans, Caribbean, and Latin Americans, youth, in and around New York in the 70s. In his book, Hip Hop America, George characterizes hip-hop in ways that resonate with me as a Generation Xer. He writes, hip-hop has outlived all of its detractors and even surprised most ardent early supporters by always changing, and with the exchange expanding its audience. It has outlived punk, post-punk, new wave, rave, house, techno, and every other much hyped musical form of the age. What is it about hip-hop that has made it so enduring? The story of hip-hop is one that varies depending on who you're speaking to. It is truly germane to the African-American oral tradition because it is perhaps more than any aspect of African-American history that I can think of, a truly oral history. You had to be there. You had to know people who were involved. You have to be willing to reach out to them to figure out the whole story. Like modern-day griots, they have shared their stories with documentary filmmakers, conference goers, in hip-hop seminars, and now in college classrooms. And just a word about this, again, that, talking about what you know is very important. Let you, be in a place and start talking about hip-hop in front of people who know and lived through it. They will be very quick to correct you, right? You do not want to get caught in that situation. So you really have to know. And if you don't know, then you better at least show that respect and talk to people who did. Those stories, of course, begin in the South Bronx. And just a historical note, like anytime you have a movement like that, those stories become valuable. You have some historical currency there. There's archives. There's people writing books. There's all kinds of people that are going to want access to that information. And believe it or not, that stuff that people were so ready to throw away. Remember they used to call rap, carap? Does anyone remember that? When I was growing up, they used to say that. Damn, again, I just dated myself. Carap, that was what they used to say. But there's that lyric, that Biggie had too. The rapping Duke, da-ha, da-ha. Remember that? Never thought hip-hop would take it this far. Give me something now. The rapping Duke. You might know what that is. I don't even know the lyric, but do you know what that is? That was a song. That was just basically making fun of hip-hop. The rapping Duke, the Duke is John Wayne. And it was this whole rap song basically with John Wayne, ha, 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 da-ha, da-ha, da-ha. That's the da-ha, da-ha. So check that out, because a lot of people forgot about that song. It was a horrible song. It was supposed to be horrible. It was making fun of rap. So that whole rap thing coming a lot of times, believe it or not, from white America, okay, and black America. Older generation was not feeling rap at first. That stuff which was so disposable and people were ready to throw away They have archives now at Harvard, at Cornell. Okay. Yeah, stuff done changed, as Biggie said, and it's definitely true. Never thought hip hop would make it this far, and that was in the '90s. We're in 2013 now, and hip hop has no signs of stopping. You know, it's got its problems, which I will get to in a minute. But where was I? These stories, of course, begin in the South Bronx, and if I had the music, I would cue it. You know, those songs. I want to hear Apache. You know what I'm saying? I want that, like those bongos. You know what I'm talking about? I'm talking about the South Bronx of the early 70s or mid 70s. The b-boys, the dancers, graffiti writers, the kids just hanging out who carried the hip-hop attitude forth, reacting to disco, the funk, and to the chaotic world of New York City in the 70s. These b-boys and b-girls, not forget about the girls, were mostly black and Hispanic. They were hip-hop's first generation. This is Nelson George talking. They were America's first post-soul kids. Nelson's descriptions of the, I should say George's descriptions, or Nelson George's descriptions of the parameters of the post-soul period is one that manifests itself in the somewhat bleak context of Ronald Reagan's America. You know, in the 80s, they basically just cut all the programs, you know, and things were getting quite bleak. And this is the moment where hip-hop leaps out. You know, it was there in the 70s, it was growing, but it really kind of like steps out, obviously, onto the main stage. This song, this tape, Run DMC, I mean, I remember, like, this was big. This was big. Getting this tape was so big, you probably don't even work now, but it was a big deal. That's 1984. He discusses them as having come of age in the aftermath of an era when many of the barriers to the American dream had fallen. Black people could now vote wherever they wanted, and attended integrated schools. They could move into any neighborhood, choose any career path, and move into the future without fear of being hurt or blocked, with some minor exceptions. Much like Davy D's connections and crossings of hip-hop to new wave and punk, George sees the partnering of Caucasians as critical to the success of hip-hop. He writes, quote, "Their interaction with hip-hop is part of the story, and they have been a big part of it since the early 80s in a number of ways, as audience, creators, and financiers." Russell Simmons, you know, his genius, he was there at the right time, but he also knew what to do. And he got the money that he needed to be able to move forward, largely from white producers and also white record executives. Born out of the way the Bronx had been left for dead. Okay, we're talking about the late 70s. We're talking about really the late 60s and 70s. Entire neighborhoods utterly destroyed by Robert Moses as he cut a straight line through the borough in the form of the Cross Bronx Expressway. You know, you can't find another highway project like that in America, where they just, you notice it never turns? You just drive straight. Like you can't do that anymore. You could never build a highway that just drove straight. You know why? Because they could do that then. They didn't have to, you know, eminent domain allowed them to be able to just draw a straight line. And that's exactly what for the most part, turns a little here and there. But, and what does that do to a neighborhood? It devastates it. Okay? If you live near it, your home value goes down. People have moved out. We're talking about, you know, I'm not from New York, but we're talking, some of you may have, you know, remember these things yourself, or have parents that remember this. You know, people were burning down their homes for the insurance money. So the Bronx was literally burning, you know, on fire. Okay, it's out of these ashes that hip hop really rises. I mean, it's like, sounds dramatic, but it's literally true. You know, it was out of these ashes that the hip hop rose like a phoenix, and along the way created some very innovative techniques. DJ Kool Herc, acknowledged to be the father of hip hop. You know, there was some debate about this for a while, but I think the matter is relatively settled that DJ Kool Herc threw what is acknowledged to be the first hip-hop party, and therefore the birth of hip-hop, in his building at 1520 Sedgwick Avenue in the West Bronx in 1973. This is hallowed ground for the hip-hop story now, and a cultural touchstone not only for the hip-hop generation, but for all of America. As buses carry tourists through streets of the Bronx, yes, there are tours through the Bronx on a bus. Probably nice air-conditioned bus, you know. Nice white people looking out like, which is good, you know, why not? Everyone loves hip-hop. Buses carrying through the streets, borrowing a phrase from Stevie Wonder, this village ghetto hip-hop land. His primary contribution was his discovery of the way that the break beat, essentially, in which the DJ extends the drum breaks, alternating back and forth between two copies of the same record. So there's basically that part of the song where they broke it down. That was everyone's favorite part, right? They didn't want to hear the rest of the record. They just want to hear the break beat. And so he starts putting those two things together. This is the beginning of this thing called hip-hop. Plugging into the city-owned streetlights for electricity. Now, you have to be very innovative. I was going to say ghetto, but innovative. We'll say innovative to think of that. You know, extension cords going all the way out, right? So they could have these parties at the park. And God, what those parties must have been like. Damn, I wish I could be there. For electricity, for mics and turntables and equipment, as innovators created a whole new form of party entertainment. Now, here's another thing that needs to be mentioned. The roots of hip-hop live in the West Indian, Hispanic, Caribbean cultures. MCing derived from toasting in Jamaica. Kool Herc was Jamaican. That's where he got it from. Davey D writes, quote, modern day rap music finds its immediate roots in the toasting and dub talk. Now, my colleagues can speak to this better than I can, but I'm just going to borrow this for a minute. Dub talk over elements of reggae music. In the early 70s, a Jamaican DJ known as Kool Herc moved from Kingston to New York's West Bronx. Here he attempted to incorporate his Jamaican style of DJ, which involved reciting improvised rhymes over the dub versions of his reggae record. So the whole history of reggae and dub stuff is a whole thing that you can look up. Like I said, we have people in the room who know a lot about it. Unfortunately, New Yorkers weren't into reggae that much at the time. Thus, Kool Herc adapted his style by chanting over the instrumental or percussion sections of the day's popular songs. Because these breaks were relatively short, he learned to extend them indefinitely by using an audio mixer and two identical records in which he continues to replace the desired segment. Okay, we're talking about mixing. And then the word part. Meanwhile, breakdancers and graffiti writers, largely Puerto Rican again, brought forms that drew upon bomba y plena, which is, if you don't know about that, that's basically some of the original music that comes from the island of Puerto Rico. Brought forms that drew upon those traditions, which were not unlike the sacred rituals being practiced by groups that practiced and looked at some of the, Taino rituals. So this stuff goes back to Puerto Rico in a lot of ways as well. Again, the Caribbean. Get the Caribbean unity here. Puerto Rico, Jamaica, they're like next door to each other. Hello. All right. Okay. Think about that one for a minute. I was going to talk about the Antillean alliances and so forth. Arturo Schomburg, and that's all I'm going to say. Okay. Whenever any of these kids, whenever any of these kids try to explain why they take to the floor, okay, and these were like, if you look at, I'm talking about basically like, we'll come back to me in a minute, but basically these early b-boys, right? When they talk about breakdancing or b-boying, as they called it at the time, whenever these kids try to explain why they take to the floor, something that moved them, so they brought their bodies into sequence with this rhythm, it was always described as something spiritual, okay? Taking to the floor, up rock, and then take it to the floor. That's what they did. Rap and freestyle draws upon these spiritual forces as well. The same animus which allows a preacher, rock steady, that's what I'm trying to remember. If you know about rock steady, the breakdancing, draws upon these spiritual forces. The same animus which allows a preacher to preach the word of the gospel in the manner in which he does not know what he's going to say next. You ever been to church? And you're having church, okay? And the preacher's just on it. Doesn't happen all the time. Some Sundays it's like, oh, time is it? This guy's all right, but every once in a while you've been to church where the pastor is just he doesn't even know what he's going to say next, I would think. You know, it's flowing through him, right? Well, that's when hip-hop is best, at its best, that's what freestyle is. That's what breakdancing is. You're feeling that. And it's flowing through you. It's coming from a higher power, right? The same manner which allows a preacher to preach the word of the gospel in a manner in which he does not know what he's going to say next, commonly called freestyling, comes from that spiritual place. The speaker is simply letting another power speak through them. If poverty is the mother of invention, then poverty largely allowed for and created an opportunity for hip-hop to grow and flourish. Growing up at the backdrop of 1980s, as I said, you know, for me, a way to register our dissatisfaction with the larger culture, a way to register a voice of dissent about what we perceive to be injustices and marginalizations, and this is, you know, with children, but you can feel that something's not right, right? You know that something's out of balance. The movie Beat Street, which just celebrated its 30th anniversary this year, was an affirmation to some of us by Hollywood and the powers that be that our contributions matter. It would not be until later, of course, that I discovered that the producer and financier of Beat Street was Harry Belafonte. So again, we're talking about the Caribbean influence. He's the one that brought Beat Street to the screen. Belafonte, of course, having been so instrumental in the development and growth of the civil rights movement, as a patron and as a sponsor of Martin Luther King. I mean, basically, like, Belafonte is mostly known for that, you know, the Banana Boat song, Deo, you know, I'm not going to sing it, but, yeah, he did that to pay the rent, you know, and then used that money, a lot of it, the money that he made, still getting paid. He probably just got paid right now when I said that. He gets a check. It's coming. He was giving that to King. You know, he was the one paying for King's salary, because, you know, it doesn't pay a lot to be leader of the civil rights movement. He is, in many ways, the quintessential example of the engaged artist activist. What scholars refer to as the golden age of hip-hop, or what a lot of people are, especially the activists, is this moment between 1986 and approximately 1992, where hip-hop consciousness was probably at its highest. Artists such as KRS-One, Criminal Minded came out. Eric B. and Rakim came out. It was a turning point for hip-hop. Public Enemy injected a critical element into hip-hop. They, more than any other artist, borrowed from the Black Power movement, you know, in very symbolic, direct ways. You know, with the S1Ws, you know, they're using those moves that the Black Panthers did. They're rapping about stuff. They were very influenced by Black Power. It really is the direct line from Black Power to hip-hop. They were rapping about consciousness and teaching previous history. You know, for a lot of us who were in crappy schools at the time, growing up in these decaying sort of urban, you know, centers and stuff, hip-hop was kind of like a school. You know, I learned a lot about things through hip-hop. Now, mind you, it wasn't always correct, but at least it planted the seed. I could go and look it up later, you know. It was something. It was that intergenerational conversation is so critical because each generation keeps starting from scratch. You know, it's like everyone learned this stuff already. We don't have to learn all of it from scratch. I didn't necessarily see it at that time, but in hindsight, I realized it was, for many of us, a school. We were exposed to music, thoughts, ideas, and things that we perhaps would not have been exposed to otherwise. The level of schools in urban areas was such that traditional teaching methods rarely reached inner city youth. For most of us, messages in hip-hop were much more prevalent and much more desirable, so that artists as a whole injected knowledge into the game, ended up teaching more than they perhaps realized, and artists who injected negativity in the game also taught more than they realized. But KRS-One especially, you know, the philosopher, right? You know, he's putting stuff into his music that young people are taking in and maybe later on realize what it was about. For example, it was to the music of Eric B. and Rakim and other early artists were some of the first examples of quote-unquote dropping science, or what would be called knowledge of self, began to be injected. Now, many of these artists were followers of the 5 percenters. And regardless of what you think or feel about 5 percenters or whatever, there was some knowledge there for a group of people who were starved for knowledge, you know, who weren't getting the knowledge that reflected their pride and their experience. So, okay, as imperfect as it may have been, it was something. It's a starting place. For young people who did not know how to access some of this information, hip-hop became our early exposure to ideas that were, if not always accurate, were empowering. The heavy emphasis, for example, on the Afro-Asiatic origin theory. I guess that would be an example of something that was problematic. But in the 90s, that was something that, you know, you could build off of that. It was at least talking about pride in something. Now they were talking about being Asiatic, which was like not African, which may have been problematic, but the so-called Afro-Asiatic, essentially, that was once empowering but also confusing, essentially lifting black people out of Africa into a more preferable origins theory that also had implications for complexion and color. The so-called Afro-Asiatic black man was one that was considered to be a higher being and more conscious, and perhaps, if not fully black, brown. There's a lot of writing on the 5%er stuff, and you can check that out. But you know, some of these early Afro-Orientalist kind of manifestations come out, or were popularized at least, by hip hop. In the 1980s, me generation of Reagan's America, sudden lust for gold and all things that had the trappings of wealth led to early hip hop style, emphasizing those heavy gold chains and gold rings, the medallions. Maybe you had to have that gold medallion and that gold chain, the dookie gold ropes, as we used to call them, and other emphasis on wearing gold. That was all well and good for rap artists, but what's a typical young man on the street going to be doing walking around a huge gold chain like that? In the 80s, where people are losing their jobs and so forth, you were pretty much holding up a sign that said, like, mug me, you know. And kids did get their chains snatched and were held up for gold chains on numerous occasions, such that many efforts to hide the jewelry became absolutely critical for survival in the streets of the city. When I was growing up, they were even taking sneakers. Does anybody remember that?
Yeah.
What?
Still
That was disappointing. Oh well, when you think about how much they cost, and you're rocking them, you know, you gotta be in a group or something. Because, you know, and that's like another important, like, you know, connection generationally, I think, because, you know, how can I say this? You know, earlier generations of black people, like, knew what it was to be afraid, okay, of violence against them. You feel me? Like, you know, not even going back to the lynching, but just being in the wrong neighborhood at the wrong time. Okay, being in what some scholars have called sundown towns. Does anyone know about sundown towns? Well, just like the name suggests, you know, if you were there by sundown and your skin happened to be black, you were in trouble. And they had signs in some of these towns. They're mostly in the Midwest. But I think some of us from the Northeast could argue we didn't have sundown towns, but we may have had sundown neighborhoods. And I can tell you in Boston, you know, if you were black, you could not be in South Boston after the sun went down. You know, you could work there, and you could be there during the day conducting business and whatever, but you couldn't be there after dark. And these towns in the Midwest, these sundown towns, had signs that, you know, basically said, don't let the sun go down on you here. N-word. Look that up. James Lowen is the person who's writing that. Jim Lowen, James Lowen. You know, so, but sometimes, you know, your generation does know a little bit about that issue of fear. How much time do we have? Okay, wrap it up? Oh, wow, okay. Okay, knows a little bit about that. So, so what happened? In the 80s, instead of wearing gold, we started wearing leather pieces. Those leather medallions with the Africa symbol. And that was a way kind of around that. Okay. So I've been told to wrap it up. I had a little bit more, but I can wrap this up. Today, hip-hop activists are asking the question, how have we gotten away from that? And how can we usher in a more conscious era once again? Activists such as Rosa Clemente, these are people you can look up. Rosa Clemente, who was the vice presidential candidate on the Green Party ticket in 2008 with Cynthia McKinney, is one example of someone who began their career in hip-hop as a journalist and writer and has catapulted into politics. Clemente in 2003 helped form and coordinate the first ever national hip-hop political convention that drew over 3,000 activists who came together to create and implement a national political agenda for the hip-hop generation. Now, it largely fell apart, but there are still those folks around, and that does not mean it cannot be resurrected. There was also a cooperation between Russell Simmons and Ben Chavis that created a hip-hop summit action network, which was largely kind of like ignored by the true activists. Rosa Clemente, in fact, writes editorial in the Village Voice entitled "Russell Simmons, You Are Not Hip-Hop," straight up. And I'll just read one part of it. Here is a news flash. Dear Russell, as quiet as it's been kept, you are not hip-hop. You didn't know? Many of us have this conversation about you and others in the industry like you every day. The industry who has pimped hip-hop culture so the chosen few can live in an MTV crib with iceberg jeans, Fat Farm sweaters, and Sean John fur coats. And she goes on and on and on. Basically, you are not hip-hop. Other hip-hop activists included Troy Nkrumah and Malia Lasso. Nkrumah, chair of the National Hip-Hop Political Convention. He's around still. Lasso is currently director of a group in Boston. They built the following as a hip-hop activist throughout the 2000s with work on voter registration and political mobilization. And you may also remember, Diddy had that whole thing, vote or die. So, there were some things happening, some work that was being done in order to get things going. And so maybe the other part in here we can change, save for the Q&A, if there is Q&A. Basically, stuff that's come up lately. Lupe Fiasco got booed off a stage when he was basically criticizing Barack Obama. It happened on the day of Obama's, being sworn in. Talking about drones and stuff. And if you know about his music, you know that he is not, necessarily a fan of Obama. That's why I didn't vote for him. And then more recently, hip-hop activism is focused not so much on national politics, but on beefs and issues that are happening within the music itself. Lyrics concerning date rape in Rick Ross's most recent song, You Didn't Even Know It. I have here, You Didn't Even Know It, but it's like, you ain't even know it. That's what you say. The song in question, in which Rick Ross talks about adding a roofie to the drink of an anonymous female and then taking her back to his room, saying, I took her back to my room and enjoyed that, and you didn't even know it. Clemente took to YouTube recently and basically just, gave a manifesto about this that was very moving and very important in terms of defending women and against misogyny in hip-hop. Hot 97 is considering blocking the song. Lil Wayne has gotten in trouble with references to Emmett Till in his music. LL Cool J came out with a song the other day. Have you all heard this country song?
Yes.
Where he basically gave a shout out to General Robert E. Lee. Thanks Lincoln for freeing him. Thank you Lincoln for freeing me. And wraps it all up with, you can fly your Confederate flag as long as I can wear my do-rag. It's like, what? That just happened this week. And finally, let me just read the last part here. There's a continuity between civil rights, the soul era, the Black Power era, and the hip-hop era, and what some people are calling post-hip-hop, the post-hip-hop generation. Yep. The question is, how do we keep hip-hop going, the development and social change movement going? Hip-hop is not just a movement, it's an industry. It's an art form and it's a culture. But like any culture, politics is a critical component. And it will be up for the next generation of hip-hop activists to decide which direction to go in. You have the Occupy movement, you have other things that can be built on. Things that have, this is the last page, have planted seeds that will yield a movement at the right time. Like most things, it takes a national crisis to trigger these already ongoing organizing efforts. What that event will be is unclear. What is clear, however, is that ongoing efforts for education about what's come before and what has worked and has not worked will speed that day. Intergenerational dialogues become very critical, such that young hip-hop organizers don't need to keep reinventing the wheel. The history is being passed down, the critical knowledge and books are being passed on, and this generation, your generation, the post-hip-hop generation, or whatever you want to call it, whatever you, literally, like whatever you all call it, will undoubtedly lead us to that new chapter. So, where are the hip hop actors? Create tuition. You know, your tuition, the tuition that you all pay, you know, they ask for it like you owe it to them, right? And they get mad at you when you don't have it. But the schools cannot survive without it, you know? And so you know, students have become constituents, and your kind of like, you know, vote is where you decide to go to school. So these schools are doing this to attract more students. You know, these are private schools largely. Tuition there is what, 30,000, upwards of, you know, heading towards 40.
It starts at 50.
50, boy.
50
Starts at 50.
It's been a while, sorry.
Is it, by having the archive there, is it attracting the students that, because I feel like they have it there maybe because they want to be cultured, but they really don't want it.
Yeah.
Because they really don't want people walking around, quote unquote, you know, just in hip hop or, so they have it there, but do they really?
Well, look, I mean, they're not fools. You know, they look at the TV, they see Jay-Z and Obama chilling. You know, Obama, and you know, they see, you know, the money that's drawn to that. They see that this industry is maturing. It's not about, you know, necessarily like, you know, some kind of like, you know, gangster stuff anymore. It has become so mainstream, I think, and it's become so much part of the power structure. And maybe that's a credit to Jay-Z, or maybe that's a credit to some leaders of, you know, at the top, the very top of hip-hop. It's hard to say, but, you know, it's like, oh, wow. Like, we couldn't get Obama to come to our school, and he knows Jay-Z. It's like, maybe we should start doing something with Jay-Z, you know, and then we can reach Obama. So, just things have changed, you know. Hip-hop in the age of Obama is like a whole other thing in and of itself, too. You know, we've taken for granted now that we've had an African-American president, you know, for a minute. You know, that has created shockwaves that are changing things all around us every minute. You know, the way that you can stay ahead of the curve is to read, study, and know what's going to happen next so that you can benefit from it, I guess. And so I think that's why. You know, I think that's why it's just become a very lucrative thing. It's not unlike what has happened, and people can tell you, too, in the profession. African-American studies has become hot, too. You know, all the leaders of almost every professional organization are doing work on race or African-Americans, whether they be black or not. Okay? You know, president of AHA, you know, Eric Foner from Columbia, you know, very respected white professor doing African-American history. A lot of people have switched what they were going to do stuff on race because it's just, so it's a business in a way. It's a nonprofit business, but you know, grants, how you work, it's out there. So things have changed. You have time for more? Yeah.
How do you feel about, I guess, these overnight activists that feel the need that when a certain situation comes up, that they voice it, but yet when it comes to the next day or another situation, they're very silent. When it comes to, like, say, for example, this Zebulon situation with the date rape, that's, they make a big noise about, but when it comes to things, other issues, they're silent. Like, say, Pop That, which is another, it's a misogynistic song, but nobody ever argues about that. So how do you feel that alters the effectiveness of the activism?
Yeah. You know, I know exactly what you mean. That's an excellent question, and I don't know if I have a complete answer to that. Some of the activists have not, you know, always called it right, and why some issues have been more heavily criticized than others is an important question. I think you know, the stuff on women being victimized and misogyny and hip hop was sort of like something that already was so-called dealt with in people's minds. Like, okay, like we dealt with the video vixen stuff, we dealt with all that, and so now we're dealing with new issues like rape, which is obviously the same issue. But I think that, to be honest, I think that activists are feeling, you know, don't feel like they have the strongest voice. They don't feel like anyone's listening. So they're doing what other people do in hip hop, which is all right, my record's not getting played. Let me get a feature with someone else. Let me get on this dude's record, and so I can get more airplay. Let me change my message from a progressive, positive one, to Live Kweli, for example, who just had a song that came out with Rick Ross. To Live Kweli featuring Rick Ross? Like, what? This is the same, when I, in 2000, Talib Kweli was like the most, he was the, you look up in the dictionary, conscious hip hop, it was Talib Kweli, and maybe Mos Def and a few other people. And he got dragged into the whole thing, so yeah, there's some, some hypocrisy there for sure. And so the way I feel about it is we have to call out the activists too, just like we call out the artists, and let them know, well, you're showing some bias here on this particular issue. Rosa Clemente is a good example. For a minute, she was like talking about Talib Kweli like he was a dog, and then I think Talib called her and was like, "It's all good, like whatever." And then she was like, "Okay, it's fine, like I spoke to him the other day, and it's all good. I still love the brother, whatever." So they're not perfect, and I don't want to. Davey D is probably, I would say, out of everybody, he's older, he's been in it longer, probably a little more balanced. But I don't know if I have an answer for you on that. How we deal with that hypocrisy? Excellent question. Comments on YouTube, email them, tweet them. Social media, is a big weapon for all of us to speak back. That's another thing that's changed since the 2000s. That was stuff still in its infancy in the early 2000s. Twitter and all that stuff, Facebook even. Now you really do actually have some ways to get back to people. You can follow them, and you can hit up their Twitter. I don't know, it doesn't always pop up on their thing, but they're seeing it, So I hope that's your question.
Before we close, anybody who is supposed to be in Dr. Walter's class, is a sign-up sheet here. Please sign.